Imagine this. It is May 1954, and the world is about to discover something that will fundamentally change how every intelligence agency on Earth understands the nature of totalitarian state terrorism. In a nondescript room in Frankfurt, Germany, a press conference is about to begin that will reveal weapons so sophisticated, so devilishly engineered, that observers would struggle to believe they were real. A former Soviet intelligence officer is about to show the West a pistol disguised as a pack of cigarettes. 3-barrel weapons firing hollow-point bullets filled with lethal cyanide compounds, an entire arsenal of assassination devices manufactured by a secret Soviet laboratory whose existence the Kremlin had always denied. And the man standing in front of these weapons, explaining each one with the calm of someone who had been trained to use them to murder people, is about to become one of the most important defectors in Cold War history. His name is Nikolai Evgenyevich Khokhlov. He is a KGB assassin who refused to murder, a Soviet patriot who chose to betray, and a man whose story will forever change our understanding of how the Soviet secret state worked and how one man's conscience could bring its darkest secrets into the light. To understand Nikolai Khokhlov, you have to understand a very particular Soviet trajectory. Born in 1922 into what appeared to be a promising future in the Soviet state, Khokhlov came of age during the most transformative and terrifying decades of Soviet history. He was a young man when Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, launching what would become known as the Great Patriotic War, a conflict that would ultimately cost the Soviet Union nearly 27 million lives and reshape the continent. But before he became a skilled operative of the secret police, Khokhlov had to first prove himself in extraordinary ways. In October 1941, when Khokhlov was just 19 years old, he was selected for a mission so desperate and seemingly suicidal that it would mark him forever as a man willing to walk into the jaws of death for his country. Moscow was under siege. The German army had pushed deep into Soviet territory, and senior Nazi officers were celebrating what they believed would be the fall of the Soviet capital. It was at this moment that the NKVD, the predecessor organization to the KGB, came up with an idea that was equal parts audacious and insane. They would plant agents disguised as members of a vaudeville quartet, a troupe of entertainers, right in front of Nazi officers who were celebrating in occupied Moscow. Once they had gained the trust and positioned themselves close to these high-ranking German military figures, they would strike. The plan was for Khokhlov and 3 other NKVD agents to assassinate key German commanders during what was supposed to be their moment of triumph. Khokhlov was a natural for this role. He was young, he spoke German, and he had a certain charisma that allowed him to move through social situations without drawing suspicion. He and his 3 fellow agents trained intensively to perfect their cover. They learned every note of their musical arrangements. They practiced their vaudeville routine until it was flawless. They studied the mannerisms of entertainers, and they prepared themselves psychologically for what was likely to be a suicide mission, because even if they succeeded in killing the German officers, escape seemed almost impossible. But then, at the last moment, the German army failed to capture Moscow. The city held, the siege was broken, and the suicide mission was canceled. Khokhlov, at 19 years old, had brushed against death and survived. The experience marked him. He had shown that he was willing to die for the Soviet state. He had demonstrated nerves of steel, and he had caught the attention of one of the most powerful men in Soviet military intelligence, General Pavel Sudoplatov, the chief of the NKVD's most secret operations, the Wet Work Department, where assassination and kidnapping were official policy. On New Year's Day, 1942, Sudoplatov himself came to Khokhlov's apartment. Rather than admonishing him for his failed mission, Sudoplatov offered him an opportunity that would define the next 15 years of his life.
Sudoplatov proposed that Khokhlov would work directly under his command, specializing in deep cover operations abroad. Khokhlov eagerly accepted. From that moment on, he would be known by the code name Whistler, and his portfolio would include some of the most sensitive assassination and infiltration operations that the Soviet state could imagine. The details of Khokhlov's first assignment remain murky. What is known from declassified documents is that he was designated to infiltrate enemy territory and potentially assassinate Franz von Papen, the former Nazi vice-chancellor who had become Germany's ambassador to Turkey during the war. But that mission never came to fruition. Instead, Khokhlov was selected for something even more spectacular: the assassination of Wilhelm Kube, the Reichskommissar of Belarus and one of the Nazi regime's most brutal administrators. Kube was a man whose hands were covered in the blood of hundreds of thousands of Jews who had been murdered under his administration in occupied Soviet territory.
In 1943, Khokhlov underwent the most intense preparation of his career. He and another NKVD agent, codenamed Karl, spent 30 days in a German prisoner of war camp, disguised as captured German soldiers. Their job was to study German soldiers, to perfect their German language, to learn the exact mannerisms and habits of Wehrmacht officers. It was a brilliant cover. If they made a mistake, if other prisoners noticed something off about their German, the NKVD could simply execute them and dispose of the bodies. But Khokhlov was too good for that. He passed the test. He had become, for all intents and purposes, a German soldier. In September 1943, Khokhlov and his partner parachuted into Nazi-occupied Belarus. They were dropped at night, dressed in Wehrmacht uniforms. Their mission was to locate Wilhelm Kube and kill him. Khokhlov, upon landing, was able to link up with local Soviet partisans who had remained behind German lines. With their help, he made his way to Minsk. The Soviet partisans had already infiltrated Kube's household. They had placed a woman named Yelena Mazanek in his household as a maid. Mazanek had been with the Soviet secret police before the war, and she knew what was required. Khokhlov briefed her, and on September 22, 1943, at exactly 1:20 in the morning, Mazanek detonated a time bomb that had been placed under Wilhelm Kube's bed. The Nazi administrator died instantly in the explosion. Khokhlov and Mazanek both escaped. But there was a price. In retaliation for Kube's assassination, the SS murdered more than 1,000 innocent Belarusian civilians. They burned villages. They executed anyone suspected of harboring partisans. The mathematics of Soviet state terrorism had been laid bare. Kill one Nazi administrator, and 1,000 innocents die in return. But in Moscow, the operation was considered a triumph. Khokhlov's wartime exploits were so celebrated that in 1947, the Soviet film industry made a movie called Feat of a Scout, Podvig Razvedchika, using Khokhlov's actual mission as the basis for the plot. The film became one of the most popular movies in the Soviet Union. Khokhlov was a national hero. He had survived the war. He had killed a Nazi. He had become the prototype for what a Soviet secret agent should be. But something extraordinary happened. Khokhlov refused the mission. In the Soviet secret state, refusing a direct order from a superior, let alone refusing an order to commit murder, was usually a death sentence. It was a violation of the very basis of the secret police hierarchy. Officers did not question, they did not hesitate, they did not develop scruples. They obeyed. And yet, when Khokhlov was confronted with the order to kill Kerensky, he simply said no. He would not do it. He would not murder this man in a foreign country in peacetime. What happened next is perhaps even more extraordinary. General Pavel Sudoplatov, his superior officer, covered for him. When Stalin himself inquired about the failure of the Kerensky operation, Sudoplatov did not report that Khokhlov had disobeyed.
Instead, he invented a story about a false Austrian passport that had prevented Khokhlov from traveling. It was a lie, but it was a lie that saved Khokhlov's life. And this tells us something crucial about the Soviet secret state. Even within the apparatus of totalitarian terrorism, there was a human element. Even men as cold-blooded as Sutoplatov, a man who had personally supervised the torture and execution of thousands, could display acts of mercy toward subordinates. Sutoplatov had taken a personal interest in Khokhlov. He had mentored him, and when Khokhlov reached a moral breaking point, he did not destroy him. Instead, he protected him.
But the reprieve was temporary. In the early 1950s, Khokhlov was stationed in Berlin, working in what was nominally a headquarters of the MVD under a cover organization called Field Post No. 62076. His work was administrative in nature, but it kept him in contact with two German agents who were on the Soviet payroll. One was Kurt Weber, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War who had fought against Franco as a young communist and was now a lowly police clerk adrift in post-war Berlin. The other was Hans Kukovich. Both of these men had access to targets that the Soviet state wanted dead, and both would eventually be drawn into the most significant assassination plot of the early Cold War era. During this period in Berlin, Khokhlov experienced a profound internal transformation that he would later struggle to articulate, but that became absolutely central to his decision to defect. He had married a woman named Yana, or Yanina as she was sometimes called, a woman of deep moral conviction who believed that her husband's work for the secret police was fundamentally evil. She did not understand the details of his operations. That information was strictly compartmentalized and secret, but she understood that her husband was involved in activities that went against basic human morality. She understood that he was participating in a system that valued power and control above human life, and she expressed to him repeatedly her conviction that what he was doing was wrong. In 1953, something changed at the very top of the Soviet state. Stalin died in March of that year, and the succession became chaotic. Lavrenti Beria, the architect of some of the worst purges in Soviet history, became a powerful figure for a few months before being removed in an August coup by other members of the Soviet leadership, including Nikita Khrushchev. When Beria fell, his protégés fell with him. Pavel Sudoplatov, who had been Khokhlov's mentor and protector for more than a decade, was arrested, imprisoned, and effectively removed from power. General Leonid Eitingan, another senior figure in the assassination apparatus, was also purged. Khokhlov, looking around, could see that the men who had protected him were falling from favor. He could see that the new Soviet leadership was uncertain. He could see that his own future in Moscow was far from guaranteed. It was in this atmosphere of uncertainty and change that Khokhlov received orders for what would be his final operation, Operation Rhine, and it was an operation that would force him to choose between his career, his safety, and his conscience. In early 1954, Khokhlov was ordered back to Moscow for an urgent briefing. He was told he would be selected for a special mission of the highest importance. The target was Georgy Okholovich, the chairman of an émigré organization called the National Alliance of Russian Solidarists, or NTS. The NTS was a thorn in Moscow's side. The organization was actively recruiting Russian anti-communists both in the West and in Soviet-controlled territories. The NTS was broadcasting propaganda back into the Soviet Union. The NTS was organizing networks of resistance. From the perspective of the Soviet state, Georgy Okholovich was a serious threat that had to be eliminated. What made this operation special was that it would take place in the West. Okholovich was based in Frankfurt, Germany, a city in the American zone of occupation. To kill him there would be an audacious demonstration of Soviet power, a clear signal to all émigré opponents of the Soviet state that they were not safe, that the long arm of Soviet assassination could reach them anywhere on Earth. The operation was codenamed Rhine, and it was given the highest classification.
Khokhlov was selected to supervise it because he had the experience, the contacts, and the trusted track record that the Soviet state demanded for such a significant operation. The logistics of the operation were meticulously planned. Khokhlov was given a false Austrian passport manufactured through the Soviet-controlled intelligence service of Austria. He was given large amounts of operational cash, $55,000 in hard currency, a fortune in 1954. He was briefed on his two German agents, Kurt Weber and Hans Kukovich, who would actually carry out the assassination. He was told that his role was to make contact with them in Frankfurt, to brief them on the target, to provide them with the weapons, and then to supervise the operation until Okholovich was dead. But before Khokhlov left Moscow, he did something extraordinary. He prepared a coded document containing sensitive details about his work with the Soviet secret police, names of officers, details of past operations, information about the structure of the assassination apparatus. He placed this document in a safety deposit box in Switzerland. Why would a loyal Soviet officer do such a thing? On one level, it seems like an act of insurance, a hedge against the possibility that he might not survive his next operation. But on another level, it suggests that on some deep, barely conscious level, Khokhlov was preparing for the possibility that he might not come back to the Soviet Union, that he might at some point need proof of his knowledge and importance, that he might need to give the West something of value. It is the action of a man who has not yet consciously decided to defect, but who is unconsciously preparing for that possibility. In 1953, Khokhlov traveled to Frankfurt. He arrived with the weapons, the money, the false documents, and the operational plan. He made contact with Kurt Weber and Hans Kukovich. He briefed them on Georgy Okholovich, on his patterns of movement, on his known associates. He provided them with the assassination weapons manufactured by Soviet Laboratory No. 12, the secret poison factory in Moscow, whose existence the Soviet government would later deny. And then, for the first time in his career, Khokhlov confronted the full moral weight of what he had been ordered to do. He was about to cause the death of a man in cold blood, a man who had never personally harmed him, a man who was not engaged in a war against the Soviet Union, but simply expressing political opposition to the communist system, a man whose only real crime was believing in freedom and organizing other exiles to work against communism. And she expressed to him repeatedly her conviction that what he was doing was wrong. What happened next is one of the most dramatic moments in Cold War history. Khokhlov made contact with Georgy Okholovich and told him the truth. He said, "Georgy Sergeyevich, I have come to you from Moscow. The Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union has ordered your assassination. The murder is entrusted to my group. I can't let this murder happen." It is almost impossible to overstate the courage this required. Khokhlov was a professional assassin. He had killed in wartime. He had been trained to kill in peacetime. He was surrounded by fellow agents who would execute him on the spot if they realized he had become a traitor. He had no guarantee that Okholovich would believe him or that Okholovich would turn him over to the Soviet agents. And yet he did it. He chose his conscience over his career. He chose morality over the Soviet state. He chose to become a traitor rather than a murderer. Okholovich immediately contacted the American intelligence services. Within hours, Khokhlov was in the hands of CIA officers. Within days, he had agreed to defect completely, to provide all the information he possessed about Soviet assassination operations, and to expose the very weapons that Moscow had given him. In an act that speaks to the incredible honor of the man, Khokhlov also managed to convince Kurt Weber and Hans Kukovich to surrender to the American authorities. The entire operation was dismantled. Georgy Okholovich lived, and lived to see the moment when his would-be assassin exposed the entire assassination apparatus that had targeted him.
When Nikolai Khokhlov walked into that press conference in May 1954 with the weapons laid out on a table before him, he was revealing something that the Soviet government had always denied existed. Laboratory No. 12,
the secret poison and assassination weapons factory of the Soviet state. The laboratory had a history stretching back decades. It had been known by different names. Laboratory 1, the special room, the chamber, were simply camera. But it had been continuously operating since the 1920s as a clandestine research facility dedicated to one purpose: developing poisons and assassination weapons that the Soviet state could use to kill its enemies without leaving evidence. Under the leadership of Professor Grigory Myronovsky, the laboratory had become an industrial center of death. Myronovsky was a gaunt man with sunken cheeks, described by those who knew him as having the appearance of an ascetic monk, but his work was anything but holy. Beginning in the late 1930s, Myronovsky and his team had tested poisons on prisoners from the Gulag system, men and women who had been sentenced to death and who were now used as human guinea pigs for scientific experimentation. The poisons tested included mustard gas, ricin, digitoxin, aconitine, curare, cyanide, and more than a dozen others. The goal was always the same: find a poison that was tasteless, odorless, and that would not be detected in an autopsy. The perfect poison would kill its victim in such a way that the death appeared to be natural, a heart attack perhaps, or a sudden illness. The forensic pathologists would examine the body and find nothing unusual. The victim's family would mourn a sudden death, and the Soviet state would have successfully eliminated an enemy without any evidence. The human experimentation conducted in Laboratory Number 12 was conducted with the full knowledge and approval of the highest levels of the Soviet leadership. Pavel Sudoplatov and his deputy Nahum Eitengon gave approval only for poisons that had been tested on human beings. When Myronovsky reported to his superiors about his progress, he would describe how he had conducted the latest experiments on Gulag prisoners. The experiments included not just poisoning, but observation of the effects. Myronovsky deliberately brought in victims of different ages, different physical conditions, different health status, so that he could understand how each poison would affect different populations. The process was clinical, systematic, and absolutely barbaric. One of the most successful products of Laboratory Number 12 was a preparation called C2 or K2, also known as carboline choline chloride. According to witness testimonies collected by Soviet dissidents and later interviewed by American intelligence, the victims injected with C2 would experience very specific symptoms. They would rapidly weaken physically. They would appear to lose height. The spinal column would compress as the muscles deteriorated. They would become calm and quiet, their personality seemingly draining away. And then, within 15 minutes of injection, they would be dead. The entire process looked, to an outside observer, like a sudden illness, a heart attack perhaps, a stroke, an aneurysm. But it was murder by poison. One of the most chilling details about Laboratory Number 12 is that it did not just develop poisons in test tubes. It developed an entire array of weapons systems that would deliver those poisons. Myronovsky's laboratory created spray devices that could disperse cyanide gas at a distance of up to 65 feet. They created topical poisons that could be rubbed on a victim's skin and would penetrate the body invisibly. They created powder poisons that could be placed in food or drink. They even designed a powder plague that could be placed in a small container, with the assassin carrying a vaccine against the plague as protection, so that he could release the plague against a target, knowing that he himself was immune. But the weapons that Khokhlov revealed at the Frankfurt press conference were the most sophisticated yet, because they combined Soviet poison expertise with precision engineering to create assassination devices that violated every expectation of what a weapon was supposed to look like. The first category of weapons revealed were 3-barreled pistols, each equipped with hollowed point bullets filled with cyanide compound. The formula was 2 parts cyanide of potassium to 1 part gum adhesive that would seal the poison inside the hollow point. Each bullet contained approximately half a gram of poison, more than 100 times the lethal dose. But it was the second category of weapons that truly shocked the Western observers. These were guns disguised as cigarette cases. The weapons were elegant, perfectly crafted in leather, looking for all the world like a luxury accessory that a wealthy businessman might carry. But inside was a complete and functional firearm. The cigarette tips inside the case were authentic. They contained real tobacco and could be smoked. But they also concealed the barrel of the gun and a sound suppression chamber that would allow the weapon to fire with almost no sound. The mechanism had been so carefully engineered that a man could hold it as if offering a cigarette to a target, fire the gun, and then simply walk away. To any observer, it would appear that the 2 men had simply had a social moment, the assassin offering a cigarette to an acquaintance. The brilliance of this weapon design is that it exploited something fundamental about human behavior and social convention. A man offering a cigarette to a friend or acquaintance is behaving normally. There's nothing suspicious about it. The distance between them is close, exactly the range needed for a reliable shot, and the sound would be minimal. Even if someone heard something, they might think it was the snap of a lighter or some other mundane sound. By the time anyone realized that an assassination had taken place, the assassin would be gone, and the victim would appear to have simply suffered a sudden cardiac event. When Khokhlov described these weapons at the press conference, American intelligence officers and military analysts were stunned. This was evidence that the Soviet state had industrialized assassination. This was proof that Moscow had not just contemplated the murder of political opponents abroad, but had created sophisticated weapons systems specifically designed for that purpose. It was a revelation of the infrastructure of Soviet terror, and it suggested that many deaths previously attributed to natural causes might in fact have been Soviet assassinations. But Khokhlov's act of betrayal would not go unpunished. The Soviet state had a long tradition of murdering its defectors, and Khokhlov was one of the most valuable intelligence officers ever to cross to the West. Worse, from Moscow's perspective, he had publicly exposed Soviet assassination weapons and operational procedures. He had demonstrated to the entire world that the Soviet Union had a program dedicated to murdering its enemies. He had to be silenced, and he had to be punished in a way that would serve as a warning to any other KGB or MVD officers who might consider betraying the state. For 3 years, Khokhlov lived under the protection of the American government. He gave extensive interviews to CIA officers. He wrote about his experiences. He spoke publicly about Soviet assassination operations. He became a voice of the defector community, warning the West about Soviet intelligence operations and capabilities. But on October 23, 1957, Khokhlov was attending an anti-communist conference at the Botanical Garden in Frankfurt. During the conference, he drank a cup of coffee. Within minutes, he became violently ill. What followed was a medical mystery that would baffle doctors and suggest something far more sinister than simple poisoning. Khokhlov developed acute gastritis. His eyes began weeping tears involuntarily. His hair began falling out in clumps. His skin developed strange red streaks, as if something inside his body was tearing itself apart. The doctors initially believed that he had been poisoned with thallium, a toxic metal used in rat poison and industrial applications. But as they began treating him for thallium poisoning, something very strange happened. The standard treatments were not working.
Then, in a moment of medical insight, the American doctors realized the horrifying truth. Khokhlov had not simply been poisoned with thallium. The thallium had been irradiated. It had been treated with radioactive isotopes before being administered to him. The thallium atoms inside his body were literally decaying, releasing radiation that was poisoning him from the inside out.
He was suffering not just from chemical poisoning, but from radiological poisoning, a new and unprecedented form of assassination. According to later accounts from defectors within the Soviet intelligence services, what Khokhlov had actually been exposed to was polonium-210, an extremely rare and highly radioactive element produced in Soviet nuclear reactors. Polonium-210 is one of the most toxic substances known. If inhaled or ingested in even tiny quantities, it will lodge in the organs and slowly irradiate the victim from the inside. The process is excruciatingly painful. The victim develops all the symptoms of severe radiation poisoning, hair loss, organ failure, immune system collapse, and eventually death. If this is true, and multiple declassified sources suggest it is, then Khokhlov was the victim of what may have been the first radiological assassination in modern history. He was the first person known to have been deliberately poisoned with a radioactive element by a state intelligence service. It was a weapon so exotic, so unprecedented, that it would not be widely known or discussed until more than 40 years later, when Alexander Litvinenko, a former FSB officer, was poisoned with polonium-210 in London in 2006. But Khokhlov had been there first. Khokhlov had been the test case for this new form of terror. The irony is stark and bitter. Khokhlov survived. Through intensive medical treatment, through repeated blood transfusions, through the dedicated efforts of American military medical personnel, Khokhlov managed to live through the ordeal. But he lost everything in the process. He lost all the hair on his body. His organs sustained permanent damage. His immune system was devastated. For the rest of his life, he would suffer from the effects of radiological poisoning. He had survived the attempt, but he had been marked by it forever. And the price paid by those he loved was immense and tragic. His wife, Yana, who had urged him to refuse the murder order, who had been the moral compass that guided him toward defection, was arrested by Soviet secret police and sentenced to 5 years of involuntary settlement, a form of punishment particularly cruel to families of traitors. His child was separated from his mother. The woman who had saved Khokhlov's conscience would spend years in Soviet exile as punishment for her husband's act of morality. Nikolai Khokhlov lived until 2007, dying of natural causes at the age of 85, a remarkable longevity for someone who had been poisoned with a radioactive element at the height of Soviet power. But his significance transcended his personal survival. He had become the translator through which the West could understand Soviet assassination operations. His press conference in 1954, with the weapons displayed on the table, had provided physical evidence of what many Western observers had long suspected, that the Soviet state had systematized murder. The revelation of Laboratory Number 11 and its work also provided a historical framework for understanding other mysterious deaths in the Cold War era. When Georgy Markov, a Bulgarian émigré and journalist critical of the communist regime, was stabbed with an umbrella on a London bridge and died of what appeared to be a heart attack, Khokhlov's revelations gave Western intelligence analysts the template to understand what had happened. The umbrella had contained a tiny pellet filled with ricin, a poison manufactured by the Soviet secret services. Markov had been murdered by Moscow and the Bulgarian secret police working in coordination. When Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the Nobel Prize-winning author who had exposed the Gulag system, was poisoned in 1971 and survived, the poison was later identified as ricin. The weapon, the toxin, the technique, all of it fit the pattern that Khokhlov had revealed 30 decades earlier. When Alexander Litvinenko died in London in 2006 from polonium-210 poisoning, the world finally understood the technology that had first been used against Khokhlov in 1957. A thread ran through all of these deaths. They were all part of the same program, the same commitment by the Soviet state to the systematic assassination of its enemies, wherever they might be found. The American response to Khokhlov's defection and revelations was in many ways a moment of triumph for the intelligence community. American agents had successfully debriefed a man who understood the innermost secrets of Soviet assassination operations. They had obtained actual weapons that could be analyzed and studied. They had gained insights into how Soviet intelligence services organized themselves for wet work. And they had demonstrated to the world that American protection of defectors was real and substantive. At a moment when the Soviet Union seemed to be ascendant in the Cold War, Khokhlov's betrayal showed that the facade of Soviet invulnerability was cracking. What makes Khokhlov's story compelling for American audiences in a way that connects to the broader Cold War narrative is that it encapsulates something fundamental about the war itself: the clash between two different visions of humanity and two different visions of the state. The Soviet Union, from its founding, believed that the state had the right to murder its opponents. It had built institutions, including Laboratory Number 11, specifically to enable that practice. It had trained officers like Khokhlov to execute those murders, and it had rationalized it all under the banner of building a new communist society.
The United States, by contrast, was a country that, despite all of its flaws and contradictions, ultimately offered refuge to those who defected. The American government protected Khokhlov at enormous cost. It debriefed him extensively, giving him opportunities to tell his story. It allowed him to speak publicly, to warn the American people about Soviet capabilities and intentions. When the Soviet state attempted to murder him, the American government provided medical care and sanctuary. This was not the behavior of an empire of evil. It was the behavior of a nation that, despite its geopolitical interests, fundamentally believed in human rights and the sanctity of individual human life. For American viewers watching this story unfold, the lesson is clear. The Soviet system, for all of its claims of having created a new Soviet man, had instead created a vast apparatus of state terror. It had empowered men like Pavel Sudoplatov to murder thousands. It had tasked scientists like Grigory Miranovsky with developing poisons to test on human subjects. It had sent young operatives like Nikolai Khokhlov to kill political opponents. And when Khokhlov finally refused, when he finally chose conscience over state, he became the first domino to fall in what would eventually lead to the exposure of Soviet assassination operations throughout the Cold War era and beyond. Nikolai Khokhlov died in 1987, just 2 years before the Soviet Union itself would collapse. He had lived to see the beginning of the end of the system that had poisoned him, that had separated him from his family, that had hunted him relentlessly. He had lived to see the world recognize that what he had revealed was true, that the Soviet state was indeed a killing machine, that it had indeed developed assassination weapons, that it had indeed murdered its opponents throughout the world. In the final analysis, Khokhlov's story is one of ultimate victory. A Soviet assassin refused to become a murderer. He chose to betray his state. He chose to expose the truth. He was poisoned for it, but he survived. And his survival and his testimony contributed to the eventual collapse of the system that had created men like him. When you watch the footage of that press conference in 1954, when you see the cigarette guns and the 3-barreled pistols laid out on the table, when you listen to Khokhlov describe with calm precision how each weapon would have been used to kill Georgy Okolovich, you are witnessing something profound. You are watching a man reclaim his humanity in front of the world, a man who said no to the Soviet state, a man who chose freedom and conscience, a man whose act of betrayal would echo through the decades, teaching the West about the depths of Soviet evil and ultimately contributing to the victory of freedom over totalitarianism.
That is the story of Nikolai Khokhlov, and that is why Americans can take pride in how the West responded to him, with protection, with belief in his story, and with the confidence that in the long struggle against communism, the truth would ultimately prevail.